Hey there, Lawndale students. It's Doug Sullivan. I'm thankful to have the chance to be able to lead today's lesson with you. It's been a while since I have been with some of you. The last 7 years we've been teaching the sophomore class. Currently, we've come back into the sophomore class and are doing one of our favorite studies in the book of Acts. But today we're going to go to the book of Romans. In the book of Acts, those that we've taught with before, you know that the first half of Acts focuses mainly on Peter. The second half focuses mainly on Paul. Romans is considered Paul's greatest work. And today we're going to look at an area where Paul gives some really clear instructions for how to live our lives. I've said it many times at Lawndale, and I was challenged by Andy Stanley on this, that there's never a time where the children of God should be bored by the person of God as they teach the Word of God. And I hope that you won't be today. I hope that you'll be challenged, encouraged, and that you'll be something that you enjoy learning a little bit more. And I know that it's been a challenge to me to go through this lesson because there's things that I have to continually improve on as well. And so hopefully you'll get something out of it. I do appreciate if you take the time to log in on the YouTube channel. You're doing that on your own. Sunday mornings, there's times where your parents force you to hop in the car and come with them. But as you get out on your own, it has to be your faith. It has to be what you decide that you're going to do. And that's a very big challenge in my life to hopefully encourage you to make it yours. Make it your faith yours, your desire to be there yours. So today we're going to go in and get in to the Word. We're going to be looking at Romans chapter 13. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 14. And I sure hope that you will gain something from this. There's a lot of things for us to look at, especially in the current environment we're in. And I think there's some pieces there that are good. We're going to look at, first, what does it mean to be a Christian? You know, there's a lot of people that claim to be a Christian. And when you say that, you say, okay, what is that? They might say they go to church. They might say that they pray before their meals. They might say they've been baptized. They might say they do good things. Is that really what Jesus taught us it meant to be a Christian or a Christ follower? He said that you'll be my disciples, and they'll know that you're my disciple by how you love one another. And I really think that that is a bigger deal than just claiming to be a Christian. We see that very much whenever we look at what the example is of a Christian. You know, a representative is what we really ought to look like, and I think of Mark Walker, who was at our church, and he's now a representative in the Congress for us. Mark doesn't represent himself, or he shouldn't represent himself. He should be representing the people who sent him there, and that's the way that it should be for all of our government officials. They should be representing the people. And whenever Paul wrote this, he was a Roman citizen, and he was in the process of prison and being killed by the Roman government, but he says some very important things for us to look at as we realize this. We should represent Christ well as Christians. If you're not a Christian, you should be able to look at those around you who are Christians and say, man, what is different about them? And want to be like that, be drawn by what you see. And I think that that's one of the things that we should be challenging ourselves. Are people drawn to look like us, to act like us? If not, we should be examining ourselves. And so hopefully you'll be able to challenge your own self as I have, as I've gone through this lesson. We're going to look here first as Paul's commands to the church. In the first couple verses, Paul looked at something that was not easy. And so we have to look at what his perspective was and then how we apply that to our lives. In the first couple of verses there, Paul says, let everyone submit to the governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. So then the one who resists the authority is opposing God's command, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be afraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have its approval. So when we look in the first three verses there, by and large, government is in place for our good. Now we have to say, okay, Paul was a Roman citizen, and he was saying to submit to the governing authorities. we really don't like that word. And I'm going to be transparent. I don't like the idea of submission. I like my ways. I don't like submitting to other people's ways. That is maybe my strong will. Maybe that's my personality. But it's very clear what Paul says here, submit. And then I think about Paul. Paul was very strong-willed. Paul had a very strong personality. Why in the world would he say that? Paul had been impacted by Christ. And being impacted by Christ, what we saw back in Acts, how Paul's life was changed, how he did a complete 180, how he was persecuting the church, and then he was completely sold out to do what Christ had called him to do, that God had ordained him to do. That's what should be the case for us. But the word submission gets a lot of bad rap. And when we look over in Ephesians 5:21 through 25, and it says, submit to each other, talking about husbands and wives. And then it says, wives, submit to your husbands. And then in verse 25, it says, husbands, love your wives. You know, that gets bad rap because it says, okay, am I lesser? No, it doesn't say that. It says that you submit to one another, and it also tells us that example, that Christian marriage is a way that exemplifies what the church should look like. So if you see that example, you should be able to say, oh, that's somebody representing Christ. They're submitting to each other. Well, Paul says here, he takes it a step further. He says, submit to the government. Submit to the government authorities. Now, I'm sure he didn't think that they were all right. If we look back in Acts, we see where Paul and Silas were beaten and put in prison. There's a time where the Philippian jailer was saved and his whole family, and then the authorities said, go let him go the next morning. And he said, nope, you're not going to just let me go without them coming down and realizing that they beat a Roman citizen with no cause. Okay. He didn't always just do what they said to do. But he said submit so that you can impact others. And I think that is what we do, both in marriage. When you see a husband and a wife, hopefully you see that in mine and Christy's marriage, that we submit to one another. I don't always get my way. She doesn't always get her way. But God should be glorified by how we live. And if we do that, then we represent him well. And I think that is also what we see here. We represent people well. I've had customers who are very, very good rule followers. They were good people. Now, they didn't know Christ, but they followed rules. And it made you wonder, okay, what's different about them? Now, those who follow Christ and they follow the rules, or they submit to those above them, wow, it gives you an opportunity to do even more than just be a rule follower. You can actually guide someone to know Christ. And that's what Paul was telling the Romans at that time. Now, we have to understand the context. Whenever Paul was writing this, Nero was in charge in Rome. And it was before Nero had started killing everybody and before Christians were fed to lions and all those type of things. But they were treated pretty bad. And there was a lot of things that were going on that weren't good. But how that Paul encouraged people to live at that time changed the course of what we see happening in Rome later on. Whenever Christianity was made the state religion for the Roman Empire, that happened because of how the Christians acted. Even after being persecuted, even after other things, when there were plagues that came, the Christians didn't run away. They actually took care of people. And that was what Paul was saying, and that is what we should be doing today, is that we look different and we represent Christ well. And that's what Paul was encouraging them to do there in those first few verses. He addressed citizenship in those first verses and how that you should live that out. You know, in general, leaders are not a terror. In general, they're there for good. Sometimes they cause problems. Sometimes they don't represent us well. Sometimes they're just for their interest. We see that. And there's government officials that I disagree with. But you know what? I'm still supposed to submit. It's no different than in marriage. There's times where Christy and I may disagree with each other, but we're to submit to each other. as we submit to God. And that is not easy for us, especially as Americans. We like to do things our way. Okay? I understand. As teenagers, it may be difficult for you guys to submit to your parents. Well, sorry, you're supposed to honor them. And if we do that well, God gets the honor and glory for that. All right, let's go on and look. Verse 4 tells us, it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason. For it is God's servant, an avenger that brings wrath on the one who does wrong. You know, there's a reason that my dad had a belt. I did get spanking sometimes. And he was the one who was in rule. Just like the government, they carry a sword, or they carry a gun, or they carry things to keep the rule of law in place. That's more for order than disorder. And when we have an orderly society, it's way easier for us to have success. Sometimes we don't like that, but that is the case. We look at verses 5 through 7. Therefore you must submit, not only because of wrath, but also because of your conscience. And for this reason you pay taxes, since the authorities are God's servants, continually attending to these tasks. Pay your obligations to everyone, taxes to those who owe taxes, tolls to those who you owe tolls, respect to those you owe respect, and honor to those you owe honor. I would tell you there's times this is difficult. I don't like being taxed more. Whenever our country was set up, we had the Boston Tea Party. And what they tell us in history was they felt like there was taxation with no representation. That's what he's talking about here, is representation. Wanting those officials to represent us well. Well, guess what? Sometimes that doesn't happen. And sometimes you have to stand up, but you still have to show honor. You have to show respect. Because if you do, it gives you the ability to show Jesus to others. You know, it's not easy to always do that. I see here we fall in the trap of showing honor and respect. And I wrote a note down here. I said, really? Seriously? Paul would want to do that even after he was treated badly, and he saw other people treated badly, and it got even worse before it got better? This was not a democracy. This was an autocratic place where you had kings and you had government that was not like what we have in America today. And you say, well, I don't like the government we have in place. Well, guys, we have the best that there's out there. You know, our forefathers did a phenomenal job of setting up judges. George Washington, there's a portrait of him in the Capitol Rotunda. Mark Walker showed it to me one time. He had the opportunity to come in, and they were going to make him king, and he resigned. He resigned. You know, and that is what some of our principles were founded on. We have a great country to live in, great principles, even when we disagree. We have a great place. But it still tells us to show honor and respect. And Paul's time is even harder because his government was not as easy to get along with. So what about after that? We look at verses 8 through 10. Do not owe anyone anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Wow. And we're going to stop there just for a second. Everything before Christ was this type of relationship from man to God. But what we see in what Jesus said changed things tremendously. The commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and any other commandment are summed up by this commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. What in the world? Guys, that is so different than how things were before. And that is what the difference is that Jesus came. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Guys, if we as Christians, if we would love our neighbors as ourselves, we would change the world. That's what Jesus intended, was for us to love those around us more than ourselves, like ourselves. Find your closest neighbor. For me, am I loving my wife that way? Am I loving my kids that way? Then, how much of an effort do I make to those who are around me? Am I willing to share Jesus with them? Am I willing to go do work with them? Am I willing to help out in ways I maybe don't enjoy. I better be if I'm going to represent him well. And that's what Paul was saying at that time. You know, he says in verse 10, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Love, therefore, is the fulfillment of the law. The fulfillment of the law. You know, Jesus made it tougher. Whenever he came, you know, he said, well, I don't have to follow all these rules. Well, wait a second. Or the commandment they had, don't murder. Jesus said, if you're angry with your brother, it's as murder. He said, don't commit adultery. Well, I haven't committed adultery, but if you lust after your neighbor's wife, it's the same. What? Jesus set the standard higher. And I think we should set the standard higher. Whenever we look at what Paul is saying there, Paul didn't necessarily want to be submissive, but he was. And he thought that that was the best course of action for others to see Christ through him and through those early Christians. The same is applicable for us today. So I think we ought to really look at that, because there in verse 10 it says, love therefore is the fulfillment of the law. Now we don't just say, oh, I love everybody, everybody's good. No, we put action behind it. We put legs behind it. The Good Samaritan, he took somebody and he did more. He bandaged him up, he carried him, he took care of him, he spent his own money. You know, through this coronavirus, I have seen churches do more good. I've seen Christian organizations. You know, in New York, Samaritan's Purse set up in Central Park and they got slammed. Why are they doing that? Well, Christians should be the first ones to do that. You know, we look at our shepherd's shelf, and we look at our food pantry. There's a church that our friends go to. They've been giving out so much food and so much money to organizations. That's what the church should do. It's the fulfillment of the law. And that law is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. We then look at verses 11 through 14. Verse 11 says, besides this, since you know the time, it is already the hour for you to wake up from sleep, because now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is nearly over and the day is near. So let us discard the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk with decency, and in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual impurity and promiscuity, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and don't make plans to gratify the desires of the flesh. Guys, that sounds way different than society. And I've looked up data, I've listened to podcasts, I've researched this. Society says, do what makes you feel good. Jesus says, do what is best for others. Society says, if I want to go down the road, or I say, sin says, make myself feel good. Jesus says, submit to one another. Love others more than yourself. Let's look at some things for a second, though. You know, of those who claim to be Christians, those marriages who claim to be Christians, the divorce rate is about the same. But did you know, for couples who pray together one time a week, their divorce rate, where the others was about 50%, their divorce rate is only about 10%. What that says to me is those people are actually putting into practice the principles that Christ said to follow. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. It's very difficult for a husband and wife to disagree, to fight, those sort of things, whenever they're praying for each other and with each other. That looks different than society. And here, you know, whenever he says, do not be carousing and in drunkenness, not in sexual impurity and promiscuity. You know, there's a lot of things as teenagers where you try to defy your parents, where you try to defy standards so that you can say, I'm doing things my way. Where you try to have as much fun right now, but yet it feels very cramped to say, oh, wait to have sex until after you're married. Or don't go out and get drunk, but yet all your friends want to go do that. Or don't do this. Wait on that. those principles are there because God wants more. A few of my students have stolen this. They know that Mr. Doug's favorite verse is John 10:10. Jesus said, "The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come that you might have life and that you would have it more abundantly," or to the fullest. Either Jesus lied or he told the truth. I believe he told the truth. He said, "The thief comes to steal these things from you, but I've come that you would have life and that you would have it to the fullest." Whenever I look at people who follow biblical principles, their life is fuller than those who don't. Sure looks like to me that what Paul was saying lines up with this. And saying that if people see us living those things out, submitting to one another, submitting to the government, not doing the things that fulfill the flesh, mentally, physically, those sort of things, then we can be phenomenal representatives of Jesus Christ. So today, we look at what Paul was saying to the people of that day. And he set a standard that was harder, it was tougher. But you know what? That standard was something that set them apart. And it caused others to look at Christians and say, man, I want to be like them. Even so that a Roman government changed the official religion to Christianity. What about for us today as Americans? Instead of us always doing things our way, what if we look different? And we submitted? It's hard. I don't like to drive the speed limit. I haven't gotten tickets. I've never paid a ticket. I had one and I got out of it years and years ago. I've driven for 30 years. But almost always I drive over the speed limit. You're saying, Doug, are you not submissive? No, I'm not following the rules just so I can say I can follow the rules. I want to be obedient to representing him well. And I should always represent him well, whether it's driving, whether it's submitting to government, whether it's how I represent him to others, whether it's in the things I say on social media, things that I watch, things I look at, how I speak. We should be great representatives. My challenge to you and to myself today is, what type of representative do I look like? I hope that you will take this lesson. I hope that you'll apply it. I haven't bored you. I hope that it's been encouragement and a challenge, and that from this, that your walk, wherever you're at in life, whether you're younger or older, that this will be something that you'll be able to apply and get real value out of it. Thanks for taking time to watch. Hope that it's helpful. And if there's ever anything that Christy or I can do for you guys, feel free to let us know. Thanks a lot.